Sarah Mitchell grew up in a small town where the sky seemed endless, but opportunities felt limited. Her father worked at the local gas station, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. They lived in a modest home with peeling paint and a roof that leaked during heavy rain. Despite their struggles, Sarah's parents always encouraged her to dream big, though neither of them could have imagined just how big those dreams would become. From the time she was 7 years old, Sarah would lie on the patchy grass in their backyard, watching military jets streak across the sky during training exercises from the nearby airbase. The thunderous roar of the engines made her heart race with excitement. She would imagine herself in the cockpit, soaring through clouds free from the limitations of her small-town life. Her classmates thought it was silly when she told them she wanted to be a fighter pilot. Girls didn't do that, they said. It was too dangerous, too difficult, too impossible. Her high school guidance counselor was no more encouraging. When Sarah sat in the cramped office during her junior year, explaining her ambitions to join the Air Force and fly combat aircraft, Mrs. Henderson looked at her with a mixture of pity and concern. The counselor pushed a brochure for the local community college across the desk, suggesting Sarah consider more realistic options like nursing or teaching. Those were good, stable careers for young women, she explained. Flying fighter jets required perfect vision, exceptional physical fitness, top academic scores, and years of intense training. The odds were stacked against anyone, but especially against a girl from a town where most people never left. Sarah's grades were good, but not outstanding. She struggled with advanced mathematics, staying up late into the night trying to understand calculus problems that seemed to mock her from the textbook pages. Her family couldn't afford expensive test prep courses or tutors. Everything Sarah learned, she learned through sheer determination and countless hours at the public library. She ran every morning before school, pushing herself until her lungs burned, building the endurance she knew she would need. The doubt from others only fueled her determination. When her physics teacher made a dismissive comment about women lacking the spatial reasoning for aviation, Sarah stayed after class and challenged him to test her. She studied aerodynamics on her own, reading everything she could find about flight mechanics, aircraft systems, and military aviation history. She memorized the specifications of every fighter jet in the Air Force inventory, including her favorite, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog by those who flew it. The A-10 wasn't the fastest or the sleekest jet in the sky. It was built for close air support, designed to fly low and slow, protecting troops on the ground. Its massive Ju-8 Avenger cannon could tear through enemy armor, and its titanium bathtub cockpit could withstand significant damage. While other pilots dreamed of flying F-16s or F-15s, Sarah felt drawn to the A-10's rugged reliability and mission of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. After graduation, Sarah enlisted in the Air Force. Her parents drove her to the recruitment center, her mother crying quietly in the passenger seat while her father gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. They were proud but terrified. Basic training was exactly as brutal as she had imagined. The drill instructor showed no mercy, pushing every recruit to their absolute limits. Sarah was often the only woman in her training groups, and some of the men made it clear they didn't think she belonged there. She proved them wrong one grueling day at a time. When they ran obstacle courses, she finished in the middle of the pack, never last. When they did push-ups until their arms shook with exhaustion, she matched them rep for rep. She learned to ignore the comments, the doubts, and the occasional harassment. Her focus remained singular and unwavering. Every challenge was one step closer to the cockpit. After completing basic training and technical school, Sarah applied for officer training school. The application process was extensive, requiring letters of recommendation, physical fitness tests, and multiple interviews. She spent weeks preparing, rehearsing answers to potential questions and studying leadership principles. When her acceptance letter arrived, she stood in her small apartment and cried tears of relief and joy. It was the first major barrier she had broken through, but she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Officer training school pushed Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. The mental challenges were sometimes harder than the physical ones. She had to learn to lead, to make quick decisions under pressure, to inspire confidence in others even when she felt uncertain herself. Her instructors were demanding, critiquing every aspect of her performance, from how she wore her uniform to how she conducted herself during tactical exercises. There were moments of doubt, late nights when she questioned whether she had what it took. whether everyone who said she would fail might be right after all. But Sarah had learned something important growing up with so little. She had learned persistence. She had learned that when you have nothing to fall back on, you fight harder for what you want. While some of her fellow officer candidates came from military families or prestigious universities, Sarah came from determination forged in adversity. That became her greatest strength. After earning her commission as a second lieutenant, Sarah faced the next mountain to climb: pilot training. The selection process was intensely competitive. Hundreds of qualified officers applied for a limited number of spots each year. Sarah's application was strong but not exceptional. Her fitness scores were good, her academic record solid, but she wasn't at the top of any particular category. What set her apart in the interview was her passion. When the selection board asked why she wanted to fly, Sarah didn't give them a rehearsed answer about serving her country or seeking adventure. She told them the truth. She talked about lying in her backyard as a child, watching jets overhead and feeling like those aircraft represented freedom and possibility. She spoke about every person who had told her she wasn't good enough, and how each rejection had only strengthened her resolve. She explained that flying wasn't just a career goal for her. It was proof that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. The board members exchanged glances, and one of them, a colonel with decades of flight experience, nodded almost imperceptibly. 3 weeks later, Sarah received her orders to report to undergraduate pilot training. UPT was designed to be the great equalizer and the great eliminator. It didn't matter what your background was or who your family knew. All that mattered was whether you could fly. The training was divided into phases, starting with ground school, where students learned aerodynamics, aircraft systems, weather, navigation, and regulations. Sarah attacked her studies with the same intensity she brought to everything else. While other students went out on weekends, she stayed in her quarters reviewing flight manuals and memorizing procedures. The first time Sarah climbed into a T-6 Texan II trainer aircraft, her hands trembled slightly as she strapped into the ejection seat. Her instructor pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was a former F-16 pilot known for being tough but fair. He watched Sarah complete her pre-flight checks, saying nothing as she methodically worked through each item on the checklist. When she started the engine and the turboprop roared to life, Sarah felt a surge of emotion so powerful she had to blink back tears. This was it. After years of dreaming and fighting, she was actually going to fly. That first flight was a revelation. As the T-6 lifted off the runway and climbed into the clear blue sky, Sarah felt something click into place deep inside her. The aircraft responded to her inputs on the controls, banking smoothly when she turned the stick, climbing when she pulled back, descending when she pushed forward. Captain Rodriguez took them through basic maneuvers, demonstrating rolls, loops, and turns. Then he said the words Sarah had been waiting for. "You have the aircraft." With those 4 words, Sarah took control. She flew the T-6 through a series of gentle turns, getting a feel for how the aircraft handled. The sensation was incredible, better than she had ever imagined. She was actually flying. All the years of doubt, all the obstacles, all the people who said it couldn't be done, they all fell away. Up here, none of that mattered. What mattered was skill, judgment, and the intimate connection between pilot and machine. But flight training wasn't all soaring euphoria. It was also grinding repetition, mastering procedures until they became instinctive and pushing through failures. Sarah struggled with formation flying at first, finding it difficult to maintain position relative to other aircraft while managing her own flight parameters. She also had challenges with instrument flying, learning to trust her instruments rather than her senses when flying through clouds or at night. Several times she came close to washing out, receiving critical feedback from instructors who questioned whether she had what it took to continue. Each setback was an opportunity to prove herself again. When she struggled with formation flying, Sarah spent extra hours in the simulator, practicing until her eyes burned with fatigue. She sought advice from instructors, asking specific questions about techniques and strategies. Slowly, incrementally, she improved. Formation flying started to feel natural, the aircraft becoming an extension of her will. Instrument flying became easier as she learned to scan her instruments efficiently and trust the information they provided. The washout rate in pilot training was significant. Sarah watched classmates she had become friends with receive the devastating news that they were being removed from the program. Some failed academic tests, others couldn't master the flying skills required. A few made critical errors that demonstrated they weren't suited for the high-stakes environment of military aviation. Each departure was a sobering reminder of how precarious her position was, how quickly dreams could be shattered. Sarah advanced through the training phases, moving from basic flight maneuvers to more complex operations. She learned aerobatics, spinning the aircraft through the sky in controlled chaos. She practiced emergency procedures, responding to simulated engine failures and system malfunctions. She flew night missions, navigation routes, and tactical formation exercises. With each flight, her confidence grew, but so did her respect for the immense responsibility of military aviation. Near the end of UPT, students received their aircraft assignments, the designation that would determine what they would fly for the next phase of their careers. This was a moment that could make or break dreams. Assignments were based on class ranking, needs of the Air Force, and student preference. Sarah had made her desires clear from the beginning. She wanted to fly the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Some of her classmates thought this was an odd choice. The A-10 was old, subsonic, and lacked the glamour of faster jets. But Sarah understood something others didn't. The A-10's mission was about courage and precision, about flying low and slow where the danger was greatest, where pilots made the most difference. When the assignment day arrived, Sarah sat with her class in a briefing room, each student's name called in order of class rank. Higher-ranked students had more choices. Sarah had finished in the middle of her class, good enough to have options but not guaranteed her first choice. Names were called, assignments announced. F-16 to Luke Air Force Base, F-15 to Seymour Johnson, C-17 to Charleston. The A-10 slots were limited, and Sarah watched with growing anxiety as they were claimed by students ranked ahead of her. Finally, her name was called. Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. She stood, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The assignment officer looked down at his list, then back up at her. A-10 Thunderbolt II, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona. Sarah allowed herself a smile, a genuine expression of joy and relief. She had done it. Against all odds, through every obstacle, she was going to fly the Warthog. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base sat on the edge of Tucson, Arizona, surrounded by desert landscape and mountains that shimmered in the intense heat. The base was home to multiple A-10 squadrons, and the distinctive sound of the Warthog's twin turbofan engines was a constant presence. When Sarah arrived for A-10 training, she felt both exhilarated and intimidated. She had made it this far, but now she faced the challenge of mastering one of the most unique aircraft in the Air Force inventory. The A-10 was unlike anything Sarah had flown before. It was heavier, more powerful, and designed for a completely different mission than the trainers she had cut her teeth on. The aircraft was built around its primary weapon, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of 30mm depleted uranium shells. The cannon was so large and produced so much recoil that the aircraft's engines were mounted high on the fuselage to prevent gun gas ingestion. Everything about the A-10 reflected its purpose: to survive in hostile environments and deliver devastating close air support to troops in contact with the enemy. Her initial training flights in the A-10 were humbling experiences. The aircraft handled differently than she expected, heavier on the controls, requiring more physical strength to maneuver during high G turns. The cockpit was a complex environment with dozens of switches, displays, and controls that she needed to operate while simultaneously flying the aircraft, navigating, communicating on the radio, and monitoring for threats. The workload was intense, sometimes overwhelming. Sarah's instructor for A-10 qualification was Major Tom Bradley, a veteran pilot with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for being demanding. He didn't coddle students or offer excessive praise. His job was to prepare them for combat, where mistakes cost lives. During her first few training flights, Major Bradley maintained a running critique of her performance, pointing out errors in her weapons delivery, problems with her radio communications, and inefficiencies in how she managed the cockpit. It was frustrating, sometimes demoralizing, but Sarah understood it was necessary. The A-10's mission required mastering close air support tactics, which meant flying low to the ground, identifying targets, coordinating with ground forces, and delivering weapons with precision while avoiding fratricide. Training scenarios simulated combat conditions, with role players acting as joint terminal attack controllers who would radio target information and clearances. Sarah had to copy coordinates, locate targets on her map, build an attack plan, fly to the target area, acquire the target visually, obtain clearance from the controller, deliver her simulated weapons, assess the results and report back, all while maintaining awareness of simulated threats and managing her fuel state. The complexity was staggering at first. Sarah would get task-saturated, falling behind the aircraft mentally, missing radio calls or forgetting steps in the attack sequence. Major Bradley would let her struggle for a moment, then step in with corrections. "Breathe, Mitchell. Slow down, you're rushing. Take your time, be methodical." His calm voice on the intercom would help her refocus, work through the problem and get back on track. Gradually, through repetition and determination, the pieces started coming together. Sarah developed better scan patterns, more efficient ways to manage information, and smoother flying techniques that left more mental capacity for tactical thinking. She learned to anticipate what would happen next in a scenario, staying ahead of the aircraft instead of constantly reacting. Her weapons delivery improved, her hits becoming more accurate, her attacks more professional. One of the most challenging aspects of A-10 training was learning to employ the GAU-8 cannon. The gun was the A-10's signature weapon, but using it effectively required skill and precision. Sarah had to put the aircraft into a shallow dive, aim using the head-up display, account for bullet drop and lead, and fire-controlled bursts while managing the aircraft's tendency to yaw from the gun's recoil. Her first live fire training against ground targets was an adrenaline-soaked experience. The cannon produced a distinctive brrrr sound, and the aircraft shook from the tremendous forces involved. It was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah also trained in the A-10's remarkable survivability features. The aircraft could sustain significant battle damage and still make it home. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit could withstand hits from ground fire. The aircraft had redundant flight control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and widely separated engines that could operate independently. Training included scenarios where Sarah had to manage emergency situations, flying the aircraft with simulated damage, making decisions about whether to continue a mission or return to base. After months of intensive training, Sarah faced her final check ride, the evaluation that would determine whether she qualified to fly the A-10 operationally. The check ride was comprehensive, testing every aspect of what she had learned. She would fly a complex mission profile that included navigation, close air support scenarios, emergency procedures, and a detailed oral examination covering aircraft systems, weapons employment, and regulations. The night before the check ride, Sarah barely slept. She ran through procedures in her mind, visualizing each phase of the upcoming flight. When she arrived at the squadron in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt the weight of everything riding on this single evaluation. Failure would mean reclassification to a different aircraft or even removal from flying status entirely. All the years of struggle, all the barriers she had broken through, it all came down to this. Her evaluator was Lieutenant Colonel James Hawkins, the squadron's chief of standardization and evaluation. He was known as fair but exacting, with standards that were uncompromising. The oral examination lasted 2 hours, covering every system on the aircraft, emergency procedures, and tactical employment. Sarah answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating not just memorized knowledge but genuine understanding. Colonel Hawkins gave no indication of how she was performing, maintaining a neutral expression throughout. The flight portion was even more demanding. Colonel Hawkins played the role of a ground controller, giving Sarah multiple target coordinates, changing priorities, adding complications and emergencies. Sarah worked through each scenario methodically, applying everything she had learned. She made a few minor errors, correcting them quickly. On one attack, her first pass wasn't quite aligned properly, so she went around for another attempt rather than forcing a substandard delivery. She knew that in combat, a bad shot could mean hitting friendly forces, a disaster she would never risk. After landing and shutting down the aircraft, Sarah sat in the cockpit while Colonel Hawkins completed his evaluation paperwork. The wait felt eternal. Finally, he looked up at her and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Mitchell. You passed. Welcome to the Warthog community." The relief and joy Sarah felt in that moment was indescribable. She had done it. She was now a qualified A-10 pilot, one of the elite group who flew this legendary aircraft. Sarah joined the 354th Fighter Squadron, a unit with a distinguished combat history stretching back decades. As the new pilot, she was immediately the subject of scrutiny from the more experienced aviators. The A-10 community was small and tight-knit, with traditions and standards that new pilots had to prove themselves worthy of joining. Some of the veteran pilots were supportive, offering advice and mentorship. Others were skeptical, particularly about a female pilot in what had traditionally been a male-dominated field. She threw herself into building proficiency, flying as often as the training schedule allowed. Each sortie added to her experience, expanding her tactical knowledge and refining her skills. She flew range missions, dropping practice bombs and firing training rounds at targets in the desert. She flew low-level navigation routes, screaming across the terrain at 500 feet. Terrain rushing past at 300 knots. She practiced night operations, learning to interpret the world through night vision goggles, a disorienting green-tinted view that took time to master. The squadron deployed frequently, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before she would face her first combat deployment. That call came sooner than expected. Tensions had escalated in a region where insurgent forces were threatening coalition troops and local populations. The squadron received orders to deploy to a forward operating base in hostile territory. Sarah would be going to war. The deployment preparations were intense. She received updated intelligence briefings on the threats in the area of operations, including enemy air defenses, small arms fire, and improvised explosive devices. She reviewed rules of engagement, the strict guidelines governing when and how she could employ weapons. She wrote letters to her parents, not knowing if she would return, trying to express everything she felt but finding words inadequate for the task. The forward operating base was austere, a collection of tents, trailers, and hardened shelters on a remote airfield. The conditions were harsh, with extreme temperatures, dust that infiltrated everything, and the constant awareness that the base could come under attack. Sarah shared living quarters with 3 other pilots in a small trailer with minimal amenities. Showers were limited, the food was mediocre, and comfort was a luxury no one enjoyed. But none of that mattered when she was flying. Her first combat mission was a routine patrol, flying over designated areas, maintaining a presence, ready to respond if ground forces needed assistance. Sarah was nervous but focused, running through her checks, monitoring her systems, staying alert on the radio for any calls for close air support. The mission passed without incident, but it introduced her to the reality of flying in a combat zone, where every shadow on the ground could be a threat. Every radio call could be the start of something deadly. Her 5th mission was different. Sarah was flying with her flight lead, Captain Mike Stevens, when they received an urgent call from a ground controller. A convoy of friendly forces had been ambushed on a mountain road. They were taking heavy fire from insurgents positioned in a canyon. The convoy was pinned down, casualties were mounting, and air support was desperately needed. Captain Stevens acknowledged the call and directed their flight toward the coordinates. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see smoke rising from vehicles on the narrow road. The terrain was treacherous, with steep canyon walls on both sides of the road and limited maneuvering room. The ground controller provided target coordinates and described the enemy positions. Insurgents firing from caves and fortified positions carved into the canyon walls. The friendlies were marked with orange panels, and the controller emphasized the danger of fratricide given the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces. Captain Stevens made the first attack run, diving into the canyon and releasing rockets at one of the enemy positions. Explosions bloomed against the rock face. Sarah watched, absorbing every detail, knowing her turn was coming. The ground controller confirmed hits but reported that the enemy was still firing. They needed more attacks to suppress the threat and allow the convoy to escape. Sarah's heart pounded as Captain Stevens directed her to attack a different target, an enemy position higher up on the canyon wall. She rolled into her attack dive, the canyon walls rising on either side of her aircraft. The sensation was claustrophobic, the margins for error almost non-existent. She acquired the target visually, a dark opening in the rock where muzzle flashes indicated enemy fire. She checked her altitude, airspeed, dive angle, making sure everything was within parameters. She pressed the trigger and her rocket streaked toward the target. The attack felt right, her aim was true, but as she pulled out of the dive, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A loud bang, followed by warning tones in the cockpit. She had been hit. Something had struck her aircraft, possibly small arms fire or shrapnel from her own weapons exploding near the canyon walls. She scanned her instruments, trying to assess the damage while simultaneously climbing away from the canyon and checking her 6 o'clock for threats. Her right engine was showing abnormal readings. Temperature spiking, vibrations increasing. The aircraft felt different, less responsive. Captain Stevens pulled alongside her, visually inspecting her jet. His voice came over the radio, calm but serious. "Mitchell, you've got damage to your right engine and what looks like holes in your right wing. Can you maintain control?" Sarah tested the controls, finding that the aircraft responded, but with degraded performance. "Affirmative, I have control. Right engine is damaged but still producing some thrust." She ran through her emergency procedures, consulting the checklist for engine damage and battle damage scenarios. The ground controller was still calling for additional attacks, the enemy still firing on the convoy. Sarah faced a decision that would define her as a pilot. She could egress the area, head back to base with her damaged aircraft, which would be the safe choice, the choice that prioritized self-preservation, or she could stay, continue attacking, give the troops on the ground the support they desperately needed, even though her aircraft was compromised and the risk had increased exponentially. Captain Stevens gave her the option, making it clear he would support whatever decision she made. Sarah thought of the soldiers in that convoy, people who had joined the military just like she had, people with families and dreams and lives that mattered. They were counting on her. This was what she had trained for, why the A-10 existed. Close air support meant being there when ground forces needed you, even when it was dangerous, even when the mission had gone bad. "I'm staying," Sarah transmitted. "I can still fight." Captain Stevens acknowledged, and they continued their attacks, Sarah making multiple runs into the canyon despite her damaged aircraft. Each time she dove back into that confined space, she knew she might not come out. The aircraft was handling poorly. The damaged engine could fail completely at any moment, and she was an easier target with her reduced maneuverability. But she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the mission. Sarah made 2 more attack runs with her damaged aircraft, each one pushing the limits of what her wounded Warthog could handle. The right engine was deteriorating rapidly, temperature gauges climbing into the red, abnormal vibrations shaking the airframe. She compensated by using more thrust from the left engine, but this created an asymmetric condition that made the aircraft want to yaw right, requiring constant pressure on the rudder pedals to maintain coordinated flight. On her 4th attack into the canyon, she employed her cannon, the thunderous GAU-8 sending a stream of 30mm rounds into an enemy position that had been particularly troublesome for the convoy. The recoil from the gun, normally significant, was now amplified by her damaged condition. The aircraft bucked and yawed more violently than usual, and for a terrifying moment Sarah thought she might lose control entirely. But years of training and instinct took over. She released the trigger, corrected the aircraft's attitude, and pulled out of the dive with mere feet to spare before the canyon wall. The ground controller's voice came through her headset, strained but grateful. "Excellent effects on target. Enemy fire has been suppressed. Convoy is moving. You saved lives today, Hog Flight." Sarah felt a wave of emotion but had no time to process it. She needed to get her aircraft back to base before something catastrophic failed. Captain Stevens took the lead position, and Sarah fell into formation on his wing as they departed the target area. The damaged engine was now producing almost no thrust, essentially dead weight. Sarah shut it down per her emergency procedures, securing the fuel and electrical systems to that engine. Flying on one engine in an A-10 was within the aircraft's capabilities, something she had practiced in simulators, but never in actual combat, with battle damage complicating the situation. The flight back to base took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah constantly monitored her remaining engine, terrified it might fail and force her to eject over hostile territory. She calculated her fuel burn, knowing that the increased drag from her battle damage was consuming fuel faster than normal. The mathematics were concerning, but she should make it back with a small reserve. Halfway home, a new warning illuminated on her caution panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping in her primary flight control system. The A-10 had redundant hydraulic systems for exactly this scenario, but if both systems failed, she would lose the ability to control the aircraft. She switched to her backup system, watching the gauges carefully. The backup held steady, but it was one more system on the edge of failure. One more thing that could go catastrophically wrong. Captain Stevens stayed with her the entire flight, talking her through each phase, keeping her focused and calm. His experience and steady presence were invaluable. He coordinated with the base, alerting them to the situation, ensuring that emergency equipment would be ready when she landed. Fire trucks, medical personnel, and the incident commander were all being positioned for her arrival. As the airfield came into view, Sarah felt relief mixed with new anxiety. Landing a damaged aircraft was always risky. If something failed during the landing, if a tire blew from undetected damage, if her remaining engine quit at a critical moment, she could lose the aircraft on the runway, possibly with catastrophic results. She ran through her landing checklist, noting several systems that were showing abnormal indications but still functioning. Tower cleared her for a straight-in approach. Priority handling. All other traffic holding clear. Sarah configured the aircraft for landing, lowering the landing gear. She heard the gear extend and felt the thunks as they locked into position. But her landing gear indicator showed only 2 green lights instead of 3. The left main gear showed unsafe, unable to confirm it was down and locked. This complicated an already dangerous situation significantly. She could attempt a landing with questionable gear, or she could eject and let the aircraft crash. Ejecting was the safe choice for her personally, but it meant destroying the aircraft, losing valuable equipment and potentially endangering people on the ground if the pilotless aircraft went out of control. The A-10 had proven it could land with damaged gear before. Sarah made her decision. She would land the aircraft. She flew her approach precisely, maintaining exact airspeed and glide path. Captain Stevens flew alongside her, calling out altitudes and distances. As she crossed the runway threshold, Sarah gently reduced power on her one functioning engine and began her flare, raising the nose to reduce her descent rate. The aircraft settled toward the runway, and she held the left wing slightly high, planning to touch down on the right main gear first, keeping weight off the questionable left gear as long as possible. The right main gear touched with a chirp of rubber on concrete. Sarah held the left wing up, the aircraft balancing on one main gear and the nose gear, slowing down but still carrying significant speed. She couldn't hold it forever. Eventually, the left wing came down, and the left main gear made contact with the runway. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought the gear would collapse. She felt it compress, heard concerning noises, but it held. The gear was damaged, but functional enough to support the aircraft's weight. She maintained back pressure on the stick, aerodynamic braking helping slow the aircraft. As the speed decreased, she carefully applied brakes, testing them gently, ready to release if the aircraft started to veer off the runway. The A-10 rolled to a stop on the runway, battered and damaged, but intact. Emergency vehicles surrounded her immediately, fire suppressant foam ready in case of fire. Sarah went through her shutdown procedures with trembling hands, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the mission now leaving her system. When she finally unbuckled and climbed out of the cockpit, her legs nearly gave out. Maintenance personnel were already examining the aircraft, documenting the damage. What they found was sobering. In addition to the obvious engine damage, the aircraft had taken multiple small arms hits. Holes punctured the wings, fuselage, and control surfaces. One round had passed through the tail section, just missing critical flight control cables. Another had struck near the cockpit, stopped by the titanium bathtub that protected her. If that round had hit just inches to the side, it would have penetrated the canopy. The aircraft was extensively damaged but had brought her home, proving once again the Warthog's legendary survivability. Sarah's squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Susan Martinez, met her after she was cleared by medical. The colonel looked at Sarah with a mixture of pride and concern. "That was exceptional flying, Mitchell. You kept your composure, completed the mission, and brought the aircraft home against significant odds. The troops you supported have already sent messages of gratitude. You made a difference today." But the colonel also pulled Sarah aside privately, speaking more candidly. "What you did was brave, but it was also dangerous. You pushed that aircraft to its limits and beyond. There's a fine line between courage and recklessness. Make sure you understand where that line is, because you'll face these decisions again, and not every outcome will be this positive." The damaged A-10 required extensive repairs that would take weeks. In the meantime, Sarah continued flying missions and other aircraft from the squadron's inventory. Word of her combat mission spread through the base and beyond. The ground forces she had supported sent official commendations, describing how her actions had saved lives and allowed the convoy to escape what could have been a massacre. Her story became known throughout the A-10 community and the broader Air Force. But Sarah struggled with the aftermath more than she expected. She replayed the mission constantly in her mind, analyzing every decision, questioning whether she had made the right choices. The damage to her aircraft had been severe. What if the gear had collapsed on landing? What if the engine had failed 5 minutes earlier? The margin between success and disaster had been razor thin, and that reality haunted her. She also dealt with increased attention that made her uncomfortable. Suddenly, she was being held up as an example, a symbol of courage and skill. Senior officers mentioned her in speeches. Articles appeared in military publications. Some of this attention focused on her being a female pilot who had proven herself in combat, breaking barriers in a traditionally male domain. While Sarah appreciated the recognition for women in military aviation, she wanted to be known simply as a good pilot, not defined primarily by her gender. The pressure to live up to this image was immense. Every flight now carried additional weight. Sarah felt like she was being watched more closely, her performance scrutinized, any mistake potentially magnified because of her visibility. She confided these concerns to Captain Stevens during a quiet conversation in the squadron bar one evening. He listened thoughtfully, then shared his own experiences with post-combat stress and the burden of reputation. "You're going to face this for the rest of your career," he told her honestly. "The mission that made you known also set a standard you'll be expected to maintain. It's not fair, but it's reality. The key is to remember why you're here. You're not here for recognition or to prove something to doubters. You're here because troops on the ground need you. Because this mission matters because someone has to do it. Focus on that and the rest becomes manageable." His words helped, but the real turning point came during a mission 3 weeks later. Sarah was providing close air support for a special operations team, conducting a raid on a suspected insurgent compound. The operation was going smoothly until the team encountered unexpected resistance and called for immediate air support to suppress enemy fighters who had them pinned down. Sarah responded quickly, coordinating with the ground team leader to identify targets and ensure no friendly forces would be endangered. As she set up her attack, she realized the enemy positions were in a similar terrain to her previous canyon mission, tight quarters that would require precision flying and weapons delivery. For a moment she hesitated, memories of the previous mission flooding back, remembering the damage, the fear, the narrow escape. But then she heard the urgency in the ground team leader's voice, the sound of gunfire in the background, the stress of soldiers in contact with the enemy who needed her help. Sarah pushed aside her anxiety and focused on the mission. She executed her attack flawlessly, delivering her weapons exactly on target, suppressing the enemy fighters and allowing the special operations team to complete their objective and extract safely. After landing from that mission, Sarah felt different. She had faced her fear and overcome it, not through bravado or recklessness, but through professionalism and focus on the mission. She realized that the previous mission, while traumatic, had actually prepared her for moments like this. She had learned her limits and the aircraft's limits. She had experienced the worst-case scenario and survived it. That knowledge made her a better pilot, more confident in her abilities while maintaining appropriate respect for the dangers involved. The deployment eventually ended, and Sarah returned home with her squadron. The reunion with her family was emotional. Her parents had aged noticeably during her deployment, the stress of having their daughter in combat taking its toll. They looked at her with a mixture of pride and relief, unable to fully comprehend what she had experienced, but grateful she had returned safely. Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the Canyon mission, a prestigious award recognizing heroism in aerial combat. The ceremony was formal and well-attended, with senior Air Force leadership present. When the medal was pinned to her uniform, Sarah thought about her journey from that small town where everyone said she would never make it, through all the obstacles and doubters, to this moment. The medal wasn't proof that they had been wrong. It was proof that determination and courage could overcome any barrier. But more important than the medal was the knowledge that she had made a genuine difference. The soldiers in that convoy had gone home to their families because of her actions and the actions of her flight lead. That was the real reward, the reason she had fought so hard to earn her place in the cockpit of an A-10. Years would pass, and Sarah would fly many more combat missions, train new pilots, and eventually rise through the ranks to positions of leadership. But she would always remember that mission in the canyon, the sound of warning tones in her damaged aircraft, the decision to stay and fight despite the risks, and the relief of touching down safely after defying the odds. It had been the defining moment of her career, the mission that proved to herself and everyone else that she belonged in the skies, flying the Warthog, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The girl from the small town who used to lie in the grass watching jets streak across the sky had become one of the elite pilots flying those jets. She had achieved her dream not through luck or favoritism, but through unwavering determination, countless hours of hard work, and the courage to keep going when every obstacle seemed insurmountable. Her A-10 had soared out of that canyon alive, damaged but undefeated, just like Sarah herself. She had proven that where you start doesn't determine where you finish, and that the only limits that truly matter are the ones you accept for yourself. In the years that followed, whenever young people, especially young women, would ask Sarah for advice about pursuing seemingly impossible dreams, she would tell them her story. She would talk about the doubters, the failures, the moments of fear and uncertainty, but she would also tell them about the moment her A-10 lifted off the runway for the first time, about the soldiers whose lives were saved, about the satisfaction of achieving something that everyone said was impossible, and she would always end with the same message. The people who say you can't do something are often wrong, but only if you refuse to believe them and keep fighting for what you want. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight for the right to prove ourselves, but those battles are always worth fighting.